All right, we're going to get started, and I'm housekeeping issues, kind of explain how to use the platform. I think others will be joining us as we kick off here. Aside from our guests, Ken, we're going to keep everyone muted to keep the sound noise down. When you have a question, unmute you. And so the way you indicate if you want us to talk to you is to scroll to the bottom of your screen and push select manage participants. And then you should see a box that says raise hand, and that'll indicate to us that you have a question. And so Ben here is going to manage facilitate that. There's also a chat function at the bottom of the screen. So if you select chat, a chat box will appear over on the right-hand side, and you can simply type a question there. And our guests, John and Ken, everyone should be able to see that as long as you select to send it to everyone. And they can monitor that, but then Ben will also be keeping tabs on that. Questions right now, you can try using the raise hand function. But if not, then without further ado, I want to thank John Foran, Ken Hiltner for joining us from Santa Barbara. I want to thank you for your thoughtful and thought-provoking addresses, which we've all watched, and for insisting on the online format of the conference. When John proposed that we host his talk online, I was embarrassed to admit that I hadn't thought of that. And it's worked out very nicely. And I'm actually very excited to utilize this format in the future. And we hope to repeat this next year in some fashion. John, Ken, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Yeah, well, let's. We'd like to begin with a question that relates to what both of you have said, actually. So, John, you oriented us to the urgent need for system change, and as you indicated, our time frame for change is pretty tight. In order to prevent slipping into a period of cascading and compounding climate change, we don't have decades; we just have years at this point. And Ken, you argued that a recognition that our culture has been written into being positions us, especially those in the humanities, to recognize that we can write into being a new world, which we understand to mean that the way we can bring about system level change is new cultural practices. So your positions are mutually supportive, but I wonder if there's a tension between the urgency that you articulated, John, and the means, since changes to culture often take a great amount of time to take hold. So if either one of you could speak to that tension between the urgency of our situation and the means, the sort of cultural means of addressing them.
Yeah. John, did you want to start, or you want me to jump right in?
Jump right in, Ken.
I'm always jumping in. John and I were in a meeting this morning, and I just immediately jumped in every time. And it's such a great question, and it's one that I've been pondering a lot, because I do firmly believe that the sort of solutions we need to be looking for are cultural interventions, reimagining practices. And that does take a long time, and we don't have the time. And I absolutely agree with John's time frame. We've talked about it before, and I think it's partly my own naivety here, because I've often thought, and I still do repeatedly, in fact, when it came to trying to initiate online conferences like this, that if we just brought attention to the problem and we showed at least one viable solution that effectively other solutions could be had, that everybody would immediately just jump on board for it. So with respect to conferences, we did research here at UC Santa Barbara, and we found that the total carbon footprint of the campus, a third of that is given to conference travel. It's just all the flying about. For our campus, it's not that big of a campus. It's 55 million pounds of CO2 released into the upper atmosphere every year. I naively thought if I just told all my colleagues this, if I brought attention to it, if I showed them that using existing technologies, existing computers, mobile devices, whatever, we could right now start cutting that down dramatically. I thought, well, that's all that you needed to do. And that shows how naive I am, because I just was astonished the amount of pushback that I received from colleagues in the humanities, even in the environmental studies department. And I have to admit, it's a little disheartening, because I don't know how the general public is going to get on board for these sort of major change in practices if we don't. So I absolutely see the problem. I just don't know a solution to it. I mean, I guess my answer is, I believe that the solutions we need will come from re-engineering cultural practices. How to bring those about and how to bring them about quickly, I just don't know. Wish I had a better answer to that.
Well, for my part, I think you've provided, Ken, with the idea of what you modestly call the nearly carbon neutral conference rather than the, zero carbon conference or the completely virtual conference. I think it's quite impressive to me to see a humanist do something as big as that in terms of actual physical reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it is a revolutionary concept. Although it will be a good test of the question, which is, how long does it take to change cultural practices in the Anthropocene? And, having even just put it that way, it seems to me that we're going to see these things happen more quickly than they have ever in the past, which is a good thing. And that's what the urgency is all about. I'm fascinated. I mean, there's so much to say here. I can't say it all at once. I couldn't possibly, but I mean, it's a great question, because to be honest, I haven't thought about it quite directly, like have to formulate a position on it. And next time we get together, Ken, I think we should ponder that ourselves or in the classroom, perhaps, if we have that opportunity again. But the connection between culture and action, of course, goes to the heart of sociology, really, my field. And I guess I've only said generalities. I guess I'll end as Ken did. I don't have an answer. And I only have these very urgent existential level questions, which drive my passion around doing this kind of work, which is something that I think once you fall into this kind of work or this insight, things can happen very quickly. That's good news. In other words, we get to be our own, experiments in questions like this. And that's a very good thing for teachers to be in front of students and so forth. We're living in very, very special times, and, there's an upside to that.
Yeah, I'll just add a little end to that. John and I have a mutual friend, Peter Kalmus, who's a climate scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And giving a little plug for a book he just wrote called Being the Change. Peter, being a climate scientist, is well in a position to assess his personal climate footprint and carbon and CO2 and methane and all that. And he just set about, in a very naive and yet effective way, there it is, Being the Change. You haven't seen the book. Peter just set about reducing his carbon footprint in a very day-to-day way as much as he could, and he reduced it tenfold. He reduced it from the average American's carbon footprint of about 20,000 pounds of CO2 or equivalent gases a year down to about 2,000 pounds. And he did it all not through any whiz-bang technology, but things like taking up bicycle rides to, and everything Peter did, I just totally agreed with. But then it occurred to me, I like riding my bike. Peter loves riding his bike. How are we going to convince 300 million Americans to get rid of their cars and ride bikes, for example? Average car, emits 6,000 pounds of CO2 equivalent gases a year. It's a huge thing. Take it off the table. But how do you undo that cultural practice? And I just don't know. And I think that to do away with the last 70 years of writing into being our love affair with the cards. It's not going to be easy.
But just I can't help jumping in and adding a quick footnote, because you make me reflect on the point that actually making these changes is very self-reinforcing. It's an incredibly exhilarating experience to work on these problems, to work with others on these problems together, to see change happening. And that's another big plus factor for us moving forward. And it's very important to stress that, how much fun it is, again, in a teaching capacity with students, introducing them to topics like this, how much fun it is, how rewarding it is, how you meet the most amazing people, etc. Because all of that's true. So if you can get people to get their feet wet, then that's more than half the game right there.
Yeah, thank you. I really, I appreciate that last point. I think that one of our important roles as classroom teachers is to inspire a sense of joy and fulfillment as we pursue these challenges. John, one of the things that struck me is you referred to one of the virtues of the 20th century political revolutions as being the fact that they had very simple, concise messages, demands, which people of sometimes slightly varying politics could get behind. And you rightly indicate, I think, that the 21st century social movements, including the movement for climate justice, should be intersectional and multiple. But practically speaking, I think that those virtues, the virtues of both those, the 21st century and the 20th century movements, can come into attention. I think it's difficult to comprehensive and intersectional while putting forth concise, simple demands that would be particularly ones that would be attractive to people of a variety of different politics. And so do you have a sense of how we could negotiate that tension?
I think it's the right question. I'm a huge fan, though, of looking for that kind of powerful, catchy, concise, precise meme. We used to call them memes, but then my students informed me this summer that meme has got other connotations now, which I haven't kept up with. Be that as it may, to give you two examples relevant to this discussion, we have my favorite climate justice meme or slogan, "System change, not climate change," does it in 5 words. I mean, of course, it's not a 10-point program in itself, but I love the fact that came, and I don't know where it came from other than seeing it on a banner in 2009 in the streets of Copenhagen, how far back one could go with that. And it'd be quite interesting to know. As a footnote on that, what a brilliant name that is for an eco-socialist organization of intellectuals, basically scholar activists in North America that I'm part of, in terms of saying what you mean without the baggage of saying we are socialists, and opening a space for conversation with others who would not be up for that conversation if we called ourselves eco-socialists of North America. So there's something powerful there. And the other example comes from some work I've done with the Green Party and the People's Climate Mobilization, or whatever we called it, in 2014 that helped organize the march in New York. Simply people and planet before profits. Yeah, 5 words again, which is it's intersectional. It gives the message about economics. It's alliterative, of course, and we go from there. I mean, I don't think these are the absolute winners. And there's a question later about, if I'm advocating a new kind of party. What's a good name for that party? I don't have one. I just think it's a lot of fun to work on these, and that's something, you know, and it gets into the larger question of telling stories and the significance of stories. Increasingly across academia in the humanities and the qualitative social sciences, where Ken and I's work intersects, and also in a lot of social movements I'm involved with. So that sort of power of stories, narrative, it's great because I think it is powerful, and I think it's something that people, in particular young people today, can participate fully in and, you know, make their contribution to help us out.
Thank you. Does anybody want to jump in, or would you like us to continue on?
I'll jump in on that, only insofar as what John ended with. Strikes me as just so important. You know, my students always are surprised when they start assessing the major environmentalists, modern environmental movements, starting with like Rachel Carson, and virtually none of them are scientists, the ones that they know. So it's Rachel Carson, Michael Pollan, Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, Naomi Oreskes, Elizabeth Colbert. They're all communicators. And the really fascinating thing, and John and I co-taught a course over the summer that really struck me, is that we sort of turn the reins of the production over to students, not just doing creative projects, but making their own films, their own YouTube shorts and all. And I think, you know, I guess I had always knew in the last 10 years, knew about the power of YouTube and all, but suddenly it occurred to me how incredibly powerful that was to actually have them formulating their way of understanding it, which, since most of these students in that class were a lot of them were fresh out of high school, it was a whole different kind of perspective than I certainly had, and a really valuable one too. So.
And finally, again, a plug for Ken. We co-taught a course. It counted as 2 courses, and we met 4 days a week for 3 hours with a group of 55 students for 6 weeks. And, you know, the depth to which you get to know each other and they get to know each other in that kind of setting is intensely wonderful. Of course, we're at a large university, 20,000 people. Loras College is a different setting. The classroom is different, but for us, this was huge. And the thing that impressed me about Ken was, for his half of the course, there were no readings that Ken brought into the syllabus, and it was completely self-constructed as it went along. I'd never heard of anything like that. And I think I'm up for any crazy idea in the classroom, but that was, and it worked so well. And we'd be happy to share the syllabi with you, of course, and yeah.
That'd be great.
The idea behind it was very simple, by the way. It was, you know, we took an issue like, quote, clean coal, and we asked students to research what they could find out about clean coal and then present it, both the positive, negatives, and whatever they could find the facts of it. Because it occurred to us that, you know, we could just give them, you know, any number of sources debunking the idea of clean coal. But that's not the way they're going to go through life after our class. They're going to do exactly what they did in our class, which is they're going to Google clean coal, and they're going to try to figure it out from there. So we just brought that into the classroom and made that the way the class was structured. And it was really interesting. I had no idea what it would be like, but boy, I learned a lot. Different sources than I would have.
I loved it.
Another question I had, here at Loras is a Catholic college, and we've had a number of events surrounding Pope Francis's encyclical. I don't know how much you know about that, but Francis at one point indicates that our nature-society dichotomy is problematic, and that's a theme that's been picked up in some post-humanist research, other dimensions of the humanities, some of the social sciences. And Ken, I noticed, you know, quite reasonably in your talk, you employ that nature-society, the culture-nature dichotomy. And I guess I'm kind of wondering how critical that dichotomy is to your your field, climate humanities? Is it a merely pragmatic distinction or contrast, or is it meant to disclose something more fundamental in the nature of things, this distinction between the human and the non-human?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and of course, in my field, even in my particular field, literary studies, eco-criticism, folks like a friend of mine, Tim Morton, has spent a good bit of time sort of breaking apart that dichotomy, and he's absolutely right in doing so. In fact, I teach a large lecture, which I'm teaching right now. It's a whirlwind tour of Western thinking on an environmental register. We start with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and literally in that first work with Gilgamesh, we talk about that sort of binary structure and opposition of nature and culture, and how it's been constructed, and why it's not so useful, actually, and not just not useful, but potentially problematic and even dangerous, because as it has played out, especially in the last 400 years, there's been this sort of privileging of the one half, nature, and sort of turning away from culture. And as it turns out, this week we're doing Thoreau's Walden, and he's like the world's best example of this, right? Thoreau lived 17 miles south of Lowell, Massachusetts, the largest industrial area in the United States at the time. Pretty much the closest thing the US had to Manchester. And Thoreau gives no thought at all to it, doesn't talk about it at all, even though it's that work that it's Lowell and everything about it and like it is what is bringing about his Walden experiment. But it's sort of a turning away from those problems. So what my students concluded is, when you looked at other writers at the time, people like Dickens, who writes, Hard Times, literally gets published in the same year as Walden, 1854. And of course, Dickens is going right into the problems we have in like Manchester. And right before that, Gaskell writes Mary Barton. They've concluded that to separate out nature and culture and not see the two together is really problematic. And it's pointing to where we are today, because, nature is this thing that is slipped away. And because, we are in the era of the Anthropocene, we really need to think about how we are in this sort of nature culture construction, rather than fetishizing, let alone actually tramping out towards nature the way Thoreau did. I don't know if that answers it, but
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so we've got a question for Ken from Jerusalem. We can see it in the live chat. I'll just read it out. As we write a new world into being, how do we ensure that voices from the Global South, for example, help construct that world? How is this the educated elite of the US writing this new world?
Such a great question, and one that I've been thinking about for a long time. That was actually on my mind when we first put together this nearly carbon neutral conference model. Because one thing that occurred to me is that what we're doing right now, academic conferences, for the most part, have really been, for lack of a better way of putting it, an elitist affair. You had to have the financial wherewithal to go to a conference. It's fine for, certain institutions, certainly faculty members and all. But for most of the developing world, they were sort of summarily excluded from conferences. Almost the entire Global South has been summarily excluded from international conferences. And the reason for that is the twofold. It shows the twofold problem with, carbon emissions, is because the cost of buying a plane ticket. And for most of the developing world, the cost of buying a plane ticket to anywhere in North America or the EU is greater than the per capita income there. And that goes hand in hand with the problem that, you're releasing, a single flight like this, you can blow your entire planet, your personal planetary, carbon emission for the year. So with our conference model, we set it up so that anyone, anywhere can participate in the conference. And we have it running over a 3-week period, which makes the time zone problem less of an issue. So in our conference model, this question could have been thrown out. I would have woken up to it, and I would have been able to answer that question. And over 3 weeks, we could have had a back and forth exchange of 10 or 15 volleys doing it. And surprisingly, it's worked pretty well. So the last major, no, not the last one, I guess two conferences ago we did on this model, it actually took place during the 2016 presidential election. So the day after the election, I actually posted a short talk asking for comments. And the very first comment that I got was from Buenos Aires. And talking about the situation in Argentina, the parallels where they were, where we were headed and all. And that opened up to an incredible international conversation that literally had over 18,000 words of discussion by the time it shut down. And I was just astonished. So I do believe, and again, I'm probably naive in thinking this, that the internet will give us the capacity to interact with each other and bring everyone into the conversation. So I don't know that our conference model is the best way or anything of the sort, but I do know that we really need to bring everyone into the conversation, because otherwise we're losing the access to the majority of the world's brain power that we haven't had before in the conferences. So I think that has to happen. I'm not quite sure how, but it has to happen.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Ken. And also thanks for the question, Nancy Menning from Ithaca, whom I happened to know years ago. It's nice to hear from you again, Nancy. I can't help but say something. So we've got another question for John this time, from Aditi Sinha, who teaches biology here at Loras. How strong, how global is the climate justice movement? Will it get us where we need to be in the context of climate change? Is there enough traction?
So, not strong enough and not global enough is the short answer. Wow. I would fold it into the previous question too about the global South, and even the question before that about Pope Francis. And I'm very happy about that development at the top of the Catholic Church. My middle name being Francis, and my upbringing as a Catholic. And indeed, the role played by spirituality in general in the global climate justice movement or in social justice movements writ large. I think all of that's super important, and part of that goes part of the way to the difficult question of, if it's not yet strong enough and global enough, how do we work toward that? And again, I have to start, the class that we taught in the summer was called What's Wrong with the World? How do we fix it? A little bit presumptuous, of course. But the first thing I had to say was, all I have are the questions. I don't know how we fix it. And that's what I get to dedicate my purpose here on the planet to, including, quite fortunately, having just fallen into the right livelihood of being in the university where you can do this work. And increasingly opportunities exist to do this work if you're lucky and if you're in the right place and so forth. So I come back to this question, I can't really directly answer any question, it seems to me, without it going off into so many different directions, because it comes back to something I remember saying at the very beginning. This is a very special time in the great eternity of time. Without being too anthropocentric about it, we're in uncharted territory here with an unprecedented crisis in a vast story with a cast of billions of people and an unknown ending, where it's kind of every contribution is welcome. And I have confidence, not confidence, I tend to feel good about the movement in the sense that, well, everything I've ever been exposed to, and I should say that my exposure to the global climate justice movement comes from having attended the COP UN climate negotiations from 2011 to 2015, 5 in a row, from Durban, South Africa to Lima, Peru, to Warsaw, Poland, and Paris, and Doha, Qatar, actually, as well. Every single person I've ever met around a COP, whether inside the conference as a delegated person from civil society or outside, because if you are there in an activist capacity, you're going to meet a lot of people that aren't credentialed to go inside, because those spaces are created without exception. This is astonishing to me. Without exception, the people I've met in and around this movement have been just amazing people to know. It's really something to feel a kind of shared passion, no matter whether we do biology or English or philosophy or social science. We have this common passion which creates I don't know what it's just a strange thing. And and this is true intergenerationally as well, because when I got to my first COP, partly the only people that would talk to me were young people that weren't famous, and partly I was too shy to ask anyone. So I was a sociologist who had never done an interview until I was in my 50s. And I've spoken with a lot of young people who are in the global movement, and of course, as students concerned in my own local setting. It's very inspiring, and it's to meet these people, like the point I tried to make about how much enjoyment and pleasure you get from participating on any level with any of this. That's what gives me a kind of unshakable hope, not a surety, a confidence of knowing what lies ahead, because I absolutely don't. And that's, again, part of you got to be hopeful if you figure, we've created all these social problems over millennia that have proven quite intractable from, a certain point of view, which is sort of my point of view. Climate change is sort of puts us on a timeline, and is a kind of it does focus the mind and around this question of urgency. In other words, it's the generation of all the people alive on the planet right now, considered as a single generation or cohort or something, who have to get, do this work and get it as good as we can make it. Boy, I don't even quite remember the question. I can look at it. Thanks very much, and thanks for asking that, because that question is what I do. The answer is, well, to be seen someday by doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, John. I have a question for Ken of my own here. So when you use this phrase, the world has been written into being, that kind of created world implies a lot of intent. And I think there's somewhat of a contrast there with how ecological problems within political systems, as a political scientist myself, for lack of a better term, that a lot of our ecological problems are an unintended product of structures that we live in, systems we live in, and how we interact, how we're conditioned to interact with one another. So the idea of a collective action problem, like no one has intended to produce climate change, right? This world wasn't written into being in that sense. So my question coming out of that is, how can climate humanists grapple with social structures that produce unintended consequences, sort of an accidental writing into being in some sense?
Yeah. It's a great question. Because I happen to be interested in a number of things, but right now, sort of writing into being in automobile culture and all that, and going back and looking at folks like Robert Moses in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, writing into being car culture in the United States. He was really doing it just in the greater New York area, but it's had such a major influence. And of course, he wasn't thinking about environmental issues, and he wasn't thinking, no one had climate change on the radar at that point. And Moses is an interesting guy to look at because he really saw this as the sort of egalitarian thing that was going to happen, that, everyone should have a car, and it was going to, he was providing housing for various different folks. A lot of what he did was thoroughly disastrous, even as what he intended to do, but he had no way of realizing that what was happening with cars and suburbia and all that would have, incredible consequences with respect to climate change, which again wasn't something he was thinking of. That's clearly the case. I mean, now we can focus in on the problem of transportation and housing and all that with climate change in mind, but you're right in that what's unclear the other ripples that will have. And I'm sure there'll be conferences 40 years in the future saying, look how naive they were. They're saying getting rid of cars. And then look at the problem we have now with mass transportation because of, I don't know what, yeah. And I mean, it really underscores, I don't know. I mean, so John and I, for 2 years, really coordinated a series of events here built on Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Environment. And if there's one takeaway from that book that really stuck with me, is her feeling that this represents an opportunity right now. We can see this as absolutely something foreboding bearing down on us, but there's a tremendous opportunity to rewrite the world into something new. And there's absolutely no question that we'll make mistakes, and no doubt big ones, but it is, and this kind of piggybacking on what John said, a very exciting time for that reason. But with any major changes, I do often wonder what the consequences will be that we're just not aware of. And there will be plenty, I think. Especially if we're thinking in terms of, physical infrastructure and all, and digital infrastructure becomes more central, that's something we may completely miss the mark on. Or if digital infrastructure ultimately, because it does have a large climate footprint as well, if that becomes the wrong road. So I don't know. That's the scary part of it, I suppose. I mean, I guess the scary thing is we need to do something, and we can't just vacillate. We have to jump in and do it. But with any time you do that, it's, who knows.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to turn you over to Jake Kohlhaus, another of our faculty here at Loras, who has a question. Jake?
I have to actually scroll up to see what I wrote. The background of this comes out of, in your talk, I thought you were a little bit one-sided with the criticisms of Elon Musk, which in some ways I totally understand. The idea that buying into this idea that technology is going to save us is problematic. But on the other hand, he's investing significant money into public transit, which you don't seem to have many problems with. And I wonder if what's going on there is a difference between, is it automobiles or private automobile ownership that's the problem? Because you're fairly critical of self-driving cars, and yet we just had a city manager at Loras a couple weeks ago who was very, very optimistic about self-driving cars because she thought that would basically end private ownership and significantly reduce the number of cars on the road. But my real question here, it's sort of inspired by that, but tries to go a bit deeper, is it seems to me the only way you create this culture of private automobile ownership or something like that, you write it into existence on the back of narratives that already exist. So for America, it's this expansionism, it's exploration, it's the great outdoors. And I'm wondering, how do you start walking back on those narratives without pushing at the deeper values? Or how do you get people to disentangle those once they've been sold a certain interpretation of what that story looks like? And a similar parallel question with academics, where travel and multiculturalism and learning foreign languages is really important to us. If we don't travel and meet people in person, that does seem to really be, you know, so there's an undercurrent of values I think we want to hang on to. And I'm just wondering how you write new stories and shift that interpretation.
Yeah, it's such an absolutely great question, and two great examples, different and yet useful because of their difference. In the simple way, one of the most profound statements a student ever said to me, we were talking about transportation, and it's very simple, and I've quoted them a number of times, and that is, he said, what we need is for riding the bus to become really cool and owning a car to be anything but. And I thought, yeah, that's it. And I think, by the way, I do think that self-driving, if not cars per se, like trams and all, that work with apps and come and pick you up and all, that may well do away with the car. If we just have a one-for-one self-driving car. I recently was at a talk where they showed an image of 100 cars lined up on a bridge. 60 cars lined up on a bridge, one bus that would transport the same 60 people and 60 bicycles. And then it had another image of 60 self-driving cars, 60 electric cars, and 60 fossil fuel cars, and they're all kind of the same. So, but you raise such a great question, and car culture is a good example. I mean, now that it's been written into being, the way that it functions representationally, cars represent so much to people, right? They represent independence, they represent freedom, mobility, spur of the moment independence. Even beyond that, they become representational items, else people wouldn't spend fortunes to buy cars to represent something about themselves, whether it's wealth or personality traits or something. So how to take that and not just, push it away, how to bring that into another way, and another way of being. And I think that's the central question. So I'll get back to that one, but I don't want to forget your other issues. So I'll jump right in with like air travel and all. The fact is, this sort of conference potential allows us to connect up with people and be in other places in a way maybe more so than just a conference. So you fly into a conference, you're there 2 or 3 days, you maybe do a little sightseeing, you maybe meet a couple people or whatever. We found that our conference, we were able to communicate far better with people over a longer period. And just in terms of the words spoken, our Q&A sessions had at least 3 times as much discussion, in some cases 10 or 15 times more. So there's a difference, but it's not always just a trade-off, it's a trade that you get back from it. And I think as technology progresses, that may develop more too. So maybe that answer folds back on the issue of like car transportation. Maybe something else is going to be gained by rethinking it. That if you look at, for example, studies of suburbia where car culture is, really taken huge root in the 20th century, and you look at the polls of people who live in suburban areas and highly dense urban areas like Manhattan, where you have in 22 or 23 square miles, you have like 1.5 million people. People often like so much more what they can get in those urban areas, which is why when they've taken polls of millennials and younger millennials like our students, at least 2 out of 3, if not 3 out of 4, want to move to those places. So I think maybe the answer is we have to show the advantages that will be gained, and those advantages often are of the same sort that we've taken for granted can only come with something like transportation. So in other words, you can express yourself and do far more with the opportunities you would have in a place where transportation wasn't quite as central. It's such a great question, and I don't know the answer, and it goes back to the earlier one. How do we do this now? Right now. Clearly, there are cultures forming all over the United States that are attempting all sorts of little parts of it. But how we make that appealing and combat with something like the automobile or car culture, incredible amount of writing into being that they've had. You know, those sectors have had enormous funding and have been enormously profitable. And back finally to your original point to Elon Musk, the concern I have over that is that what Musk does, and he's sort of my straw man here, but he is a good example. He doesn't bring about or see the need for much cultural change. So Elon Musk's most recent vehicle is a 5,000-pound SUV that, if it's like every other car on the road, 3 out of 4 times you take it for a trip, it'll only have one person in it. There's no real change there, you know, other than the fact that it's electric powered, but most of the electricity generated in the United States, of course, is coming from coal-fired power plants. So our students over the summer rightly know that really, you know, most Teslas are in fact coal-powered. Really need to have a fundamental shift in thinking away from that. And Musk, because he is a technological kind of guy, doesn't seem to have that worked out yet. Because I would argue the technologies that we need have been around for 100 years. You know, a bus is 15 times more efficient than a car in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. A train is 37 times more efficient. We need to make these more culturally appealing, and we need to, and maybe this goes to your original question, and I don't know the answer, but I'll reformulate it, rephrase it in terms of this. How do you make the bus or train more appealing to people who find cars appealing for all the reasons we do? How do you leverage that? Don't know.
Thank you. This will we have another question from Tina Edwards, another Loras faculty. She writes, is it up to the future generations on how to solve the problems that are outlined by writers of the current period? Can we write something that inspires change, but does not necessarily choose how that change happens or what exactly needs to be changed? Is there kind of openness in that sense?
I'd like to ask Tina what she thinks about that question, where it comes from, what she suspects might be an answer to it. And I missed what your academic specialization is, Tina.
Oh, so I am a chemist, so I come from the natural sciences. I guess my question stemmed from Ben's question from earlier. And so I think we kind of like went somewhere else with Jake's question. And so mine kind of builds off of Ben, where he was talking about, you know, if we are making, like, trying to make these changes and not really knowing what those unintended consequences are for the future. And it made me think of Ken's idea of writing our future and essentially writing about maybe things where cars are removed in the future, right? And then that could potentially have unintended consequences if our future generations are then inspired to go ahead and do that. Well, can we write something where it's kind of bringing about like the focus of the problem? And I know that this is still kind of comes back to the idea of this is looking at sort of longer term and not necessarily a solution that is good short term, but you know, if we are writing about things now, like, those future generations can really think about and grapple with, okay, like, this is the current status of society, and that time has passed, and for this time period now, this is the way that change can come about that's appropriate for this time period, right? Because I think that's something that, you know, if you are writing for the future, that there's so many shifts in culture and influences that it might be hard to get future generations, if you're writing, to do like one particular thing. So, like, you know, like get rid of cars or something like that. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. John, did you want to jump in, or you?
I'll jump in and also note that Nancy is also built on that question. I think we can all see in the chat space. And I don't know if Nancy wants to chime in also. She may not, somehow she's introduced herself, but yeah. Let's have a look at that part of the question too then. So building on that question that Tina just described in more detail, I made a distinction in my talk between being evocative and prescriptive, process-oriented versus outcome-oriented. That's a good way to put it. I didn't actually say that, but that's more elegant. And although Tina seems to be asking about specifying neither process nor outcome, what if the writing emphasized process over outcome? Would that be effective? So I will take a stab at some of the issues that this conversation is invoking now to, let's see, to put in a plug for a couple of things. One is the whole genre of what's now called cli-fi, climate fiction, as writing about the future for the present. I don't know, maybe it's, I've read too much sociology, but I really find that my students react more profoundly and intensively and deeply with materials that aren't really scholarly articles, which I have to say now, to make a critique of my own discipline, sociology has a very bad habit of sort of sucking the life out of topics that really are all about life, that really are about people and our problems and our attempts to solve them. And I think that's really unfortunate. And so I assign fiction and we watch movies. Movies is also, I think, an extremely important medium. And this is not a question of dumbing down the material in any way. It's really about finding better material than we can offer from our own discipline, at least in my case. And believe me, I have the highest regard for sociology. I define it as the study of everything. The first principle of which is everything is connected to everything else, etc. So why don't we do it better? But a particular film that's future-oriented and also about the present and also solution-oriented is a French film called Demain, Tomorrow. I mean, people are nodding. If you've been lucky enough to see it, it's a look at a series of initiatives, local initiatives all around the world to right now in the present begin to live kind of prefiguratively in the world that we imagine we would like to have. And so it looks at the transition town movement that comes out of England, and Rob Hopkins is associated with that. It looks at all kinds of things from around the world that people are doing that are largely below the radar, and we have to seek them out. And I think that's also part of the good news, is that, you know, when Paul Hawkins wrote this book called Blessed Unrest, which in 2008 was kind of gave a foreshadowing of this efflorescence of new social movements that are all about sustainable, creative, imaginative ways, intersectional and interdisciplinary, making connections in new ways, kinds of ways of living and being, and all the experiments that are going on. He started to count the number of organizations and movements that were devoting themselves to this in 2008, and he got into the thousands, and then he realized that the answer was probably more like 100,000 around the world, or who knows how many, and we just don't know about them. So many big things are happening in small places locally that are going in this direction. And in a way, it goes back to that question of how do you make a global climate justice movement? You have to bring us into conversation with each other. You have to find the technologies to do that, one of which we're using right now, and so forth and so on. A final two more quick plugs by way of taking a stab, or maybe three. One is a new book called Emergent Strategy. I guess I mentioned it, yeah, in my talk. I only came across that in the past 6 months when I was part of a group of 30 academics across the University of California and the California State University system who never really have a dialogue between each other. In fact, of the 10 UC campuses and the 26 CSU, we don't really have dialogues within our own system. It's just too vast, too difficult, we're too busy. So we got 30 faculty together from the two systems representing, it was kind of weird when you added up all the unusual specialties that we had, like the little niches, like 27 different disciplines, some of them quite interdisciplinary, to get up to 27. And we formed what we called a Knowledge Action Network, a CAN. The purpose of which was to generate pedagogical materials for teachers who want to teach whatever their discipline is, and whether it's university or K through 12. They want to bring issues of sustainability, the climate crisis, climate justice, carbon neutrality into their classrooms to try and begin a discussion, now we're creating a website so that it can be shared more widely, to share ideas that we have. And so Emergent Strategy is the name of a newish book by Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a student of Octavia Butler, the great African-American science fiction, climate fiction pioneer who's no longer with us. It's about this kind of bottom-up, create your agenda as you go, so very process-oriented, leaving the outcome open-ish, and Ken participated in this. We did a series of workshops and we had an online conference. And in fact, again, after this talk, we can send the links and the documents to some of these things, which you might be interested in, and we'd be interested in sort of expanding this Knowledge Action Network around sustainable education, which is a good link to your whole project, Chris. So Emergent Strategy, the film Demain, climate fiction, and before we go, I know we have 15 more minutes, I want to put in a plug for something else that came out of that project. I met some scholars from CSU Northridge, CSUN, down toward LA, who've been taking students into the community near the campus, mostly students of color, because the faculty are in the Chicano Studies Department. And the communities were, that the students came from and that were adjacent were Latino communities, but some of them have been doing this with students for quite a long time. This may not be revolutionary for yourself. In a smaller college, there's this kind of service orientation sometimes that we don't have at the University of California. But the exciting part was to connect students who are studying sustainability, creating a better world, solving these huge unsolvable problems, studying them in the classroom, to actually trying to transform a community. And we're very fortunate here. There's a community literally adjacent to UC Santa Barbara. You just cross a bike path, appropriately enough, and you're in Isla Vista, which is about 1 square mile with 10,000 people living in, crowded into really substandard rental housing, but on the ocean, literally, as well. And there is a project emerging from undergraduates now that is calling itself EcoVista, the idea being to make that transition across all of the areas where that would have to happen, from community gardening to the food justice that involves, to the housing problem, to creating jobs that are sustainable in the community, a whole range of things. And students have tremendous creativity around this. And they experience working together on projects that really they devise. And they see the result the longer they stick around. So we'll be getting the word out about this EcoVista idea, because they explicitly from the beginning, this is 2 undergrads who came to me last March and said, hey, we have an idea they were already doing. And now we have students going into the community as part of their class to work on this project. they conceive it as something they would like it to succeed, of course, but also then to be a model of a kind of eco-village idea that college students could involve themselves in while they're in college, in their own community, whether at the university or back home as they move on. So that's all of the little things I want to sort of say as a way to kind of indicate, you know, just how much is out there and how exciting all of this is. And that's kind of probably is my closing remark.
I could take a stab at Tina's question too. It's such a good one. The notion, Tina, as you put it here, you know, something that inspires change, but does not necessarily choose how that change happens or exactly what needs to be changed. I'm going to sound like a nihilist here, and I guess I am in a way, and I'm actually going to say that it might be kind of a cornerstone of my discipline, in that invoking Heidegger again, who I brought up in the talk, who I used to use all the time, but now rarely do for whatever reason. I guess I felt nostalgic. Heidegger talks about the notion that there's so many background practices that we're born into when we're sort of thrown into the world that we're not, you know, thematically aware of a lot of it, because it just forms the backdrop of our existence, and the things that we foreground we're more thematically aware of may not include those practices. And I've talked before about something like the approach used by early feminists, first wave feminists in the 60s and 70s and even beyond, was really not to you know, be architects of vast change that would happen, but rather just to draw attention to those background practices that escaped our attention, to draw attention to really the problem, to bring it out and make us thematically aware of what normally escaped our attention. And at the end of the day, I think that's a huge part of what we need to be doing. You know, and this, under the categories "do as I say, not as I do," with this idea of this online conference approach, I jumped right in and said, well, look, we can actually not just draw attention to the problem, but we can actually throw out a solution. And it wasn't meant to be any kind of, you know, really well-polished solution, but just a proof of concept that something could be done. But I do wonder if it isn't our job to, on the one hand, I want to say in a simple way, draw attention to the cultural practices, but I really mean draw attention, I really mean disrupt by drawing attention to. And then when that happens, then maybe more folks would come in and be the architects of that change. And it goes back to Ben's question before about how do we know what we're going to do. And the one thing is very clear, and it goes back to the other question we had regarding the global south and all. This is a global problem that will require global solutions that will come from everywhere. So to quote, who am I quoting here? I forget. But the future, you know, always laughs at the present. The idea is that what the future solutions are going to be, it's just very unclear. And we can talk about something like online conferences that might completely miss the point. But what we really need to do is create a rupture of the present so that a new future can emerge out of it. I know that sounds really nihilist, like I just want to, you know, I want to tear down. But I do think we need to do that and draw attention to these practices. And because a lot of folks just aren't aware of them. So, I mean, aside from what we do in academia, you know, you look at a film like Cowspiracy, I showed to my students, a really problematic film. It gets a lot of facts wrong and all, but a really disruptive film, you know, to make people think about day-to-day practices, personal practices, you know, what you eat, but think about it in a new, different way. I mean, I think things like that are really useful because they set the stage for change, even if they don't bring that change about or lay it out in any kind of detail. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe that's my closing statement. I don't know.
Well, although I told you gentlemen to stay on until 8:15, I advertised to everyone else that it would be an hour. So
no. Apologies for going over that.
No. It's this has been This has been a very great discussion. Thank you for your time. Thank you for recording the videos. It's been delightful. I think